This is the first in 3 Monday nights, so you're very welcome if this is the first time that you've joined us here in the diocese on a webinar. So if you're not too familiar with webinars, just to say to you, there's one little button I want you to keep an eye on during this night. So down at the middle of your screen, you'll find there is a button which says Q&A. And that button will give you the opportunity to ask a question or to make a comment during the evening. And you'll be most welcome to do so. In terms of this being the first of 3 nights, I suppose November can be a time when we like to reflect back. And so the first of our nights is tonight with Martina Lehane Sheehan, and she's going to have us thinking about praying with our sorrow as we look at that part of our lives. Next week, Father Jim Cogley will explore remembering our departed with us. And then our final night, this fortnight, on the 16th of November, Elizabeth Gary Brosnan will be with us. And she will have us reflecting on how do we live with grief and loss. And I suppose this year, more than any year, that sense of grief and loss is strong and deep within us. So just before I introduce Martina to you, you might just like to kind of settle yourself, give yourself permission just to be here, just to relax, enjoy the evening. We're just going to work together and pray together and reflect together for about a half an hour. Martina Lehane Sheehan is someone who may be very familiar to many of you. She has worked with us here in the diocese many times on the course in pastoral ministry. She's given evenings of reflection here. Some of you may know her from your pastoral area when she has given a Lenten talk. For those of you who don't know Martina and for whom this is your first encounter, delighted that you will meet her tonight. Martina comes with a rich array of gifts and talents. She is first of all a pilgrim like you and me. She is a spiritual director, she's a psychotherapist, and she's an author. And you may be aware of many of her books, ones like Seeing in You, A Whisper in the Stillness, among others. And she has a new one coming out just before Christmas. Martina, it is just lovely to have you with us. Thank you for taking this time and delighted to have you with us. So I'm going to let you start away and maybe just get us reflecting on how do we pray with our sorrow.
Okay. Thank you, Francis. And it's great to be here. This time of the year, for many years, I would probably be crossing the county bounds on maybe a Tuesday or a Wednesday evening, maybe giving a course for something in the diocese. And this time it's through screens. But that's good too. Any time to be connected with Kerry is good for me. So this evening, we're going to look at the theme of, praying with our grief, praying with our sorrow. And I'm not going to be talking so much about saying prayers, even though that is very much part of what we do in November and very much part of journeying with our grief and with the remembering of the deceased and so on. But I will be looking more at kind of the spirit of prayer where our grief and our sorrow comes in. And I'm just going to take a little quotation from the author and poet Cal Gibran. And he says, "Your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the self-same well from which your laughter rises is sometimes filled with your tears." In other words, our sorrow and our joy come from the same well. So praying with our sorrow, for me, it's like turning towards it, befriending it, opening it up to the Spirit, to the Holy Spirit. And the opposite of that, I think, is turning away from it, denying it. And when we turn away from our sorrow, we turn away from ourselves, and we create a barrier between ourselves and our joy. Because as the poet said, our sorrow and our joy come from the self-same well. So the opposite to befriending and praying with it is to stop the flow, which is often called repression. And repression is like a dam holding back a river. And of course, a river longs to flow. And our emotions, the word emotion means feelings in motion. So they long to flow, to be in motion. So it's the most natural thing in the world for us to turn in prayer towards those wounds and blockages and sorrows and griefs that we all hold in our very being. When we sort of try to anesthetize ourselves against our grief, and anesthetize meaning distract ourselves or numb our grief, or try to throw ourselves into social media or shopping or whatever we do, it tends to come out in symptoms. And the symptoms might be depression, the symptoms might be anxiety, and the symptoms can be physical. So it's really, really important to turn and pray with our grief. And when we're talking about grief tonight, we're talking not just about the grief of those we have lost, even though of course that's primary. But we're also talking about the many other griefs and sorrows of situations, people, roles, possessions, dreams, and so on that we lose. Even the loss of youth brings grief. And often it isn't recognized in our society. And so we suffer alone. And I'm going to again draw a little quotation here from the author Judith Burst. And Judith Burst describes grief as: our losses include not only our separations and departures from those we love, but our conscious and unconscious losses of romantic dreams, impossible expectations, illusions of freedom, illusions of safety, the loss of our younger self, the self that thought it would always be unwrinkled and invulnerable and immortal. So I don't know about you, but there are days when I look in the mirror and I grieve the unwrinkled self. And that can be grief too. I was running a workshop on grief a couple of years ago in a retreat house, and it was a full day. So I was encouraging people not to attend it too early in their bereavement, to leave a little bit of time pass. And one woman contacted me and she said to me, I'm going into the second year now. Do you think I'll be able for it? And I said, you should be. I'm sure you will be. So I put her name in and she joined the group for the day of bereavement. But what I didn't know was she was talking about having lost her cat. And I was very embarrassed when I discovered that she was inside in a group with those who had lost a parent or a spouse or a sibling, and she was talking about her cat. And it might be easy to laugh at that, but actually, grief is a loss of anything or anyone that has helped to define us. And define us meaning it's part of our identity. So that cat was part of her identity, and it brought up grief, and maybe it brought up many other ungrieved losses. So the wonderful thing about prayer, I find anyway, is that we're almost outside of time. All time is in the present. So there are grievances and grief and sorrows in our life that we could call complicated grief or delayed grief, meaning it's sitting there in our bodies, in our psyche, in our hearts, unattended to. And when we come into real prayer, it tends to come to the surface. And I put an emphasis there on real prayer, meaning not just something off of our heads or a formula, But when we really come into the depth of our being with our God who loves us, we will meet whatever is blocked or hurting or not flowing in our lives. And past and present become one. And I'm saying that from an experience of one day reading John 11, verse 21. And it's that gospel text where Martha comes to Jesus, and Martha and Mary are grieving the death of their brother Lazarus. And they let him have it. They say, look, Martha says, if you had been here, our brother wouldn't have died. So she lets rip the anger and the grief and the whole lot. And we're told that Jesus was moved with tears and moved towards Lazarus. In fact, every gospel text that we read, we see that Jesus had a gravitational pull towards those who were grieving, towards the broken parts. And we all have broken parts. So that gospel came alive for me one morning in a little prayer room. And I was reading it. And suddenly I was transported back to a time when I was about 6 years of age. And it was a couple of days before Christmas. And my mother was on the stretcher, and the blue light of the ambulance was on, and she was being taken yet again into accident and emergency. And I had kind of repressed a lot of that. And when I read John 11:21, I let rip. And I found myself saying to Jesus, if you had been here, we would have had a parent when we were small, because my mother and father were seriously ill when we were children. And boy, but he got it. And, I felt a bit guilty. But later I saw that the Psalms are full of lament. They're full of that prayer of where were you, God? Where are you? And God seems to have such an intimacy towards that part of us, the part of us that needs to lament, that needs to pray out of our grief, out of our sorrow. Sometimes it's helpful to do it with music. I call that prayer too, with poetry. Actually, only 2 weeks ago, I wrote a little poem. My mother is dead a long time now, but I wrote a poem to her. And I found huge healing in it. And I thought it was just for myself. And I shared it in a little retreat that I was giving. And lots of people asked for a copy. And I said, but why would they want it? And then I discovered that, what is personal is also universal. So when we share our grief with others, we actually help them to grieve as well. Our wounds become bread that's broken and blessed. We are broken and we become blessed and blessing for each other. And I find it so consoling when we see that when Jesus appeared, at Pentecost, the wounds were still in his hands. His grief was still luminous. And so it tells me that our sorrow and our grief is not something to hide, but it's something to pray into, to talk into, to share, because grief that is pushed away becomes grievance. And you know what grievance is like, don't you? Grievance is like a type of bitterness. So praying with our grief is like cracking the hard shell and softening us towards ourselves, softening us towards our own hearts and towards our own story. In the Beatitudes, it says, blessed are those who mourn. And in this month of November, the Celtic Christians said it's the time of the thinning of the veil, where we cross the threshold believing, and I know that Father Jim Cogley will be talking about this next week, believing that those who have died are still with us. And maybe they help us to grieve in this time of the thinning of the veil. as we enter into the November month of softening and befriending our grief.
That's really helpful, Martina. We might come back to some of that in a minute, but maybe we'll just take a few moments just to listen to the clouds veil, actually. You know, God is at our side. Just to give ourselves just the chance just to digest some of that, and we'll come back to it then. Thank you.
Even though the rain hides the stars, even though the mist swirls the hill, even when the dark clouds veil the sky, you are by my side. Even when the sun shall fall in sleep, even when at dawn the sky shall weep, even in the night when storms shall rise, you are by my side. You are by my side. Deep the feast of life, where saints shall gather in deep peace. Deep in heaven's light, where sorrows pass beyond death's sleep. Even though the rain hides the stars, even though the mist swirls the hills, even when the dark clouds veil the skies, you are by my side. Even when the sun shall fall in sleep, even when at dawn the sky shall weep, even in the night when storms shall rise, you are by my side. You are by my side. Blessed are they who sing the fellowship of saints in light. Blessed is heaven's King. All saints adore the Lord Most High. Even though the rain hides the stars, even though the mist swirls the hills, even when the dark clouds veil the skies, you are by my side. Even when the sun shall fall in sleep, even when at dawn the sky shall weep, even in the night when storms shall rise, you are by my side. You are by my side.
You are by my side, and you're reminding of us of that, Martina, that God is always by our side. I suppose there's a few questions have come in, and maybe I might start with that one of, we'll get to the let's rip, but you know when you're just heartbroken, do you know when you're just in tears and sad, and what do you do with that?
With the tears, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you pray when all you're doing is crying?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Well, yeah, there's a very practical thing first to that, actually, is that, you know, there is, of course, the danger that we become flooded with our grief. And there is a thing called flooded, where it overwhelms us. So there are two words to remember there, actually, that might be helpful. And that is that when we're journeying with our grief and our sorrow, to remember two words: contact and space. Contact meaning we need to make contact with it, but also to create a little bit of space between the grief and our everyday life, meaning that we can't stay there all the time. We need to create a little window of tolerance where yes, we go there instead of denying it, but then we need to do things that strengthen us and that nourish us so that we're not flooded. But yes, I mean, the tears are so important. And I always remember a story of being in a little prayer room in Macroom when I was growing up. And I used to go in there praying with a piece of scripture, and very often. And it was a time of a lot of healing happening in my own life. And healing brings the tears. It just brings the tears. And there's nothing as embarrassing as when you're in there in a small space and you have no tissue with you, and the tears come, or worse still, the snots come as well, and the snots and the tears come together. And one day a woman came up and tapped me on the shoulder and said to me, "Listen, love, don't you ever be embarrassed about dim tears. Dim are liquid prayers."
Oh,
So that's what I keep remembering, that our tears are liquid prayers. They are prayers.
yeah. That's really helpful, because sometimes you kind of think, oh, I should be praying, but these are our prayers
These
at this
are our
time.
prayers. These
Yeah.
are our prayers. Yeah, yeah.
And I loved also, and as a question has come in here about it, in terms of, okay, letting rip. How do you let rip with God? I know how to let rip with others, but how do you do it with God?
um, well, I think this, I suppose, as I mentioned, the Psalms are full of it. So the first thing is to give permission that God can take all our emotions.
Mm,
And it isn't just the nice stuff. And it isn't just the top layer from the head up, but that what is in the belly. And what I find personally really helpful is to do a little bit of writing, a bit of journaling. I find it really helpful, just to maybe write it out and roll it up maybe, or tear it up or whatever. And that's prayer as well. And it's all kind of working through it. But I suppose relationship, like you said, I know how to let rip to other people, and that's so true, because but like prayer is relationship. And one stage of grieving, according to Kubler-Ross stage of grieving and all of that, is anger. It's one stage. It's not the whole of it, but it's one stage, and it needs to be released. So writing can be helpful, little rituals, even if you're walking, to be conscious of praying it out of you in the walking, praying out the anger, but it has to be acknowledged.
yeah, because often we kind of we feel we should be polite with God, or that,
Yes.
well, God obviously has a bigger plan when we've lost somebody we love. Surely God has a bigger plan, so therefore I shouldn't be angry. But we have anger, haven't we? And we have disappointment and we've sadness, and
And I'm glad you mentioned that there, Francis, because it's the most unhelpful thing when somebody says, because I can remember when my dad died and I was just about 13, and I remember where I was standing when a relation of mine, who was an adult at the time, said to me, "Be sure now," it was the day of the funeral, and she said, "You need to be strong now. Your father wouldn't want you to be crying."
yeah,
And we have done so much injustice to ourselves and to each other with when we have kind of taken away the permission to let the crying or the anger, or just to let it out, when we're trying to sanitize our personalities almost. So cliches like they're in a better place, or God has a bigger plan, it doesn't help the grief. It just doesn't. Even though there's an element of truth in it, it doesn't help the relationship between ourselves and God, and it doesn't help the clearing of our grief. In fact, it creates what's called delayed or complicated grief. And that woman meant well when she said to me this day, when my dad died, she said, "Now don't you be crying, your dad wouldn't want it."
I
And
know.
I stopped the grief. But of course, it came out 10 years later. So we need to let the heart open, because God can take it and hold it and is listening to us. In in Matthew. Is it a Matthew? I think I wrote it down earlier today. I think it's Matthew 11:28 or something. There are those lovely lines. Come to me, you who are burdened. So come to me. That's what you'd say as a child. You know, come to me with it. Tell it all to me. I'm listening. Tell me about the sorrow. Tell me about the grief. And that's relationship.
That's a lovely image. I'm just thinking that you're leaving us with, Martina, of God wanting to hear our sorrow, wanting to hear the grief, the sadness, just the depth of oomph within us.
Yes. And if we can find anything, there's a couple of pieces of music, even they're not even coming to mind now. There's one called, I think, Up Where You Belong, or a few like that, and they really invite that. Maybe I actually have some of them. Maybe if you don't mind, I might just give them a website where I'm putting up stuff as I'm thinking of it at the moment.
Yes.
And it says I'm thinking of it, and I'm putting up stuff about kind of grief and praying and things at the moment. And it's Rua Rest. Well, it's www, obviously, and Rua Rest, RUAHREST.com. And I'm going to put up the name of that song tonight, actually, because I can't think of it right now. But music helps, poetry helps, writing helps, and it's all prayer.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. You know, it's been great listening to you and talking to you, Martina, and I just hope it's been helpful to people to reflect on that all of our sorrows, our griefs, from the small to the really deep and long lasting, that they're all part of what God is willing to hear and to bear with us and carry with us. And maybe it's for each of us to go home tonight remembering that.
Yes. And simple little things, Francis, like lighting a candle, see it as a prayer, especially the month of November, you know.
Thank you, Martina. That's really helpful. I'm just conscious I have the candle lit here beside me.
You have.
And I do think that, you know, maybe as we conclude tonight, it is helpful to light a candle and just maybe just to recall the person you love, the person that you feel is missing to you at the moment, and just recall that the absence that you feel is really the space that holds them. That they're not gone from you. And we will gather here next week again. Martina, thank you for being with us tonight. And next week it will be, as you mentioned, Father Jim Cogley, who will be joining us from Wexford, and he'll be exploring how do we remember our departed, and all the story that's within that, in that remembrance. And maybe as we go from this place, it is that invitation that you've left us with, Martina, that maybe it's lighting the candle, it's taking the walk, it's maybe sitting down and writing a letter to God. Maybe sometimes it's easier to write it than to try and say it.
Yes.
And it's finding that space in our own day between now and the end of the week, before we meet again next Monday, just to honor that sadness that we might be carrying for whatever reason, and most especially in the month of November, we remember the sadness because our loved ones, some of them, are gone to God before us. So with that in mind, I bid you farewell. Slán, Tamil, Slán to Martina, Slán to all of you who've been with us, and Gadesha Slán until this day next week. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. God bless. Take care.